The Mafia is a basic part of American life, deny it or not. Every generation has had its underworld kings. Unforgettable personalities that commit unspeakable crimes. The Mafia. It's a name that speaks fear, representing the fascinating, appalling underside of our national experience.
What did you say about all the accusations? What did you think about it?
Often they've been glorified. We call them names like Al Scarface Capone, Lucky Luciano, or the Dapper Don. Many meet their fates in undignified ways. It's not surprising. They're playing a high-stakes game. The Mafia is a business. It turns over more money than America's 10 largest industrial corporations. How did they get this big? Who runs the show? To understand, one has to go back to a quieter, more peaceful time. Back at the turn of the century, America was still a largely white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. But the face of America was changing dramatically. The new wave of immigrants jostled the sense of stability of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, known as WASPs. Many cities became clusters of ethnic neighborhoods, populated by the Irish, the Jewish, the Italians, and others. Most immigrants arrived in the U.S. with very little money. They lived in poverty in city slums, and their lifestyles seemed improper to some WASPs. Local crime was on the increase. Street thefts, prostitution, gambling, and burglaries. And crime was also becoming more violent.
Well, it's been said in the defense of ethnic groups that feel slighted by their association with crime, particularly the Italians, that crime is not an ethnic phenomenon, which it certainly isn't. It certainly goes across all ethnic groups. But one must understand that extreme criminality is often found among groups which are, let's say, the hungriest when they arrive.
There was also another side to it. Many immigrants brought with them a hostile attitude toward the law. The Irish had been oppressed by the British, and for them opposition to British law was heroic. The Italians from southern Italy felt that the law was unjust, and the Jews fled Eastern Europe because they'd been persecuted and denied the right to own property. So for many, getting around the law was an honored activity. The WASPs feared the changes they were seeing. They wanted to establish more control. They were particularly worried about the drinking habits of the new immigrants. The Anti-Saloon League and other temperance movements were already making their opinions known.
Alcohol is a detriment to youth. I wish that all the youth of America would see it in the same light that I do.
On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution became federal law. Enforced by the Volstead Act, it banned liquor sales, production, and consumption. Most just called it prohibition.
Prohibition was foisted on this country by white Protestants who were worried about the new immigrant groups, worried about social control, and they saw the abolition of the liquor traffic as a way of imposing a kind of social control on these new immigrant groups.
However, many Americans did not want to stop drinking. They'd suffered through World War I, and they wanted to have some fun. A strong demand was created that needed someone to supply it. For many immigrants who were looking for ways to make money, prohibition was a dream come true. An illegal but highly profitable career as a bootlegger proved irresistible. The Irish were the first bootleggers. In many cities, they were the saloon keepers and bar owners, and they had close ties to the police and to the politicians. Very soon, however, the Irish met fierce competition.
Then when you come down to bootlegging, of course, this would be at precisely the time that the young Italians and the young Jews raised in American slums would be coming to manhood. And there was an opportunity to move quickly into an expanding business activity.
Most newly arrived Americans played the game straight, committed no crimes, and rose by their own legitimate efforts. Gangsters decided to steal and kill not because they were Irish, Jewish, or Italian, but because they were criminals. Ironically for the WASPs, however, criminal circumstances actually worsened as a result of Prohibition.
No one could predict what would happen with Prohibition. People expected it to work. It's an example of the inscrutability of history. Often consequences are unintended, and Prohibition is a classic example of it. No one thought that it would produce an organized crime institution like it did.
The WASPs believed they could use Prohibition to control the recent immigrants. What they didn't know was that a new, defiant attitude toward American justice was taking root. Some Italians believed more in the Mafia code than in any United States law. And soon, Italian criminals would begin to dominate the other ethnic gangs. But as we'll see, the 1920s were still a time when all the gangs needed each other. Bootleggers connected coast to coast, moving booze. The underworld was becoming coordinated, and organized crime, the Mafia, was born. In turn, the Mafia helped organize American justice. The onset of Prohibition proved an enormous business opportunity for the underworld. What it really spawned were the criminal gangs that we know today. With the passage of the Volstead Act, modern organized crime came together and developed its web-like structure. It was like an event waiting to happen. Many of the early bootleggers had been involved in the newspaper wars. Major newspapers hired gangs of thugs to force news dealers to carry their paper and not the opposition's. It was a natural graduation into the Prohibition liquor trade, where making money and violence went hand in hand. The most violent and the most successful bootlegger in New York was the Irishman Owney Madden, a convicted murderer and gang leader. When illegal bars or speakeasies opened all over New York, many of them served Madden's beer, a brew called Madden's No. 1. Like other successful bootleggers during this time, Madden went from being a nasty small-time killer to running a major underworld business empire.
Owney Madden of New York was a stone killer. He ran that town. Ed Sullivan, who was a Broadway columnist in the 1920s, said that knowing Owney Madden in the 20s was like knowing the mayor.
The story was the same in Boston, a city with a strong Irish community and a history of resistance to Prohibition. Most of the bootleggers had names that we've forgotten today, with one notable exception, Joseph P. Kennedy, the founder of the Kennedy dynasty. During Prohibition, he was already a bank president and making money on the stock market.
So many of the Boston Irish were involved in bootlegging in the 1920s, and I think perhaps Joe did it on one level just to be one of the guys, to have this connection to the old community from which he had sprung and which he had frankly long ago left behind. It's a way of returning to his ethnic roots in East Boston to become a bootlegger.
I think Joe Kennedy did have a natural affinity with other people who saw themselves as fighting the establishment. I don't think there's any doubt that Joseph Kennedy was in contact with a number of Mafia characters during the 1920s.
Kennedy kept quiet about his underworld associates, although he would maintain contacts with organized crime figures all his life. His public associates were more refined. When the Harvard class of 1912 had its 10th alumni gathering, Joe played a critical role in making it a roaring success.
And Ralph Lowell of the Boston Lowells, who was the secretary of the class of 1912, later described Joe as our decennial Santa Claus, the man who had provided the booze. Joe's operatives brought the booze ashore in Plymouth, just as the Pilgrims had come ashore in 1620. And it was great stuff. The Harvard reunion in 1922 was very grateful for this high-class booze provided by Joe Kennedy to the class.
Most of his bootlegging activities weren't so altruistic. Bootlegging was a business for Joe, and it helped him launch the Kennedy fortune. It was, of course, also illegal, and the federal government was doing its best to stop the bootleggers. It was a difficult task. Many people didn't respect the law, and their determination to keep drinking demonstrated that creativity was alive and well in the 1920s America. Much of the alcohol came across the Canadian border. Much of it came from another famous family, the Bronfmans of Canada. Sam Bronfman used the Prohibition trade to build the Seagram's empire, which he ran from an office in Montreal.
The Bronfman Group were able to set up transshipping companies in the West Indies and even in Mexico, so that what they really did was to set up a transportation system all the way around the United States, West Coast, East Coast, West Indies, and so on.
All of this took sophisticated organization, and it was a major reason why Prohibition eventually led to the creation of organized crime. Moving large amounts of liquor around was quite different from robbing banks or petty extortion. You had to ship the liquor. You had to get it past the Coast Guard. You had to store it in warehouses and sell it to customers. This was big business, and it became the business of organized crime. One of the main masterminds was Arnold Rothstein, who was aptly called the Brain.
Rothstein is significant because his complete, I can only say, intellectual involvement as the Brain marked the emergence of organized crime as a complete business entity. The further elaboration of the syndicate along business lines is generally due to him.
Arnold Rothstein didn't have a gang as most bootleggers did. He was the money man, fronting money for various enterprises, and then being owed money. Rothstein came from a comfortable Orthodox Jewish family on the Upper West Side of New York. He was an inveterate gambler, and legend has it that the notorious 1919 World Series was fixed by Rothstein. It's the greatest scandal in the history of American baseball. 8 members of the Chicago White Sox were bribed to throw the series to the Cincinnati Reds. But it's one fix that Rothstein didn't do. He just heard about the tampering and made a fortune betting on the right side. Rothstein has a pupil, the young Meyer Lansky. Lansky will eventually take over from Rothstein as the mastermind behind the Mafia. Lansky is one of the contacts between the bootleggers in New York and Seagram's Liquor in Montreal. He's one of the ways that the Bronfmans moved their booze into the United States. Much of the booze came from Canada or Europe, and one of the most important stepping-off points for this flow of alcohol was a small island about 20 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The island of St. Pierre, a vestige of the French Empire, was outside the legal jurisdictions of both the United States and Canada. It proved enormously useful to bootleggers like Rothstein and Lansky.
Legal booze would come into St. Pierre from Canada and Europe, be offloaded there, and get fraudulent papers for shipment somewhere else. So the legal manufacturers could say, we just sent it to St. Pierre, we don't know what happened to it after that.
The liquor would then make its way to the U.S. coasts, where the large ships would anchor 3 to 5 miles offshore, outside U.S. coastal limits.
So every summer you would have what were called motherships off the coast of anywhere from Boston to South Jersey, and small ships would go out and take the booze off. It was so common, of course, that you could go to New York and tourist ships would take you out, and you could watch the bootleggers at work.
The Coast Guard would send high-speed boats out to try and intercept the bootleggers. But sometimes the corruption of prohibition reached them too. Once, Oni Madden's partner bribed a Coast Guard cutter to bring in 700 cases of booze to a Manhattan dock. For the bootlegger who got his shipment ashore, the challenges weren't over. Anybody who wanted to hijack his booze could do so. It was frequently known where the booze was going, even what truck it was on. And this in turn meant that rival bootleggers had to hire gunmen to protect their trucks, which proved yet another step in fostering the armed mobsters who would control organized crime. Prohibition had been meant to herald an era of sobriety and clean living. Instead, it was the dawn of unprecedented violence in American life. Gangsters were becoming a way of life. And few cities would prove to be more tainted, more corrupt, and more violent than the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. It was a town where the politicians were bootleggers, the cops were criminals, and the good times rolled. Philadelphia, in the 1920s, America's second largest city. The rivers ran murky in this town. February 1927, the city witnessed its first machine gun slaying, a murder worthy of the movies. That night's evening bulletin used a photo diagram to show how it happened. Racket chieftain Mickey Duffy was the target. Badly wounded, he escaped with his life. His bodyguard died. So what was going on in this city of brotherly love, Philadelphia? This was one of America's oldest, most respected cities. It called itself the workshop of the world and led the nation in producing locomotives, streetcars, textiles, and even hats. It was a proud place, with a blue blood upper class that lived on historic Chestnut Hill and along the so-called Main Line. But there was another side to Philadelphia, less proper, more seamy. Philadelphia didn't just lead the nation in industrial production. It was a leader in corruption. It was a one-party town. The Republican machine had run the city since the 1870s. The politicians ran a protection racket, being paid off by the gambling houses, the prostitutes, and the saloon keepers. Philadelphia's best-known mobster was Boo Boo Hoff. He had grown up in a Jewish immigrant neighborhood in South Philadelphia.
Boo Boo Hoff, who was the most important bootlegger in Philadelphia, was a relatively small man. Looked really very much like any small businessman. That is, nobody would have mistaken him for a criminal, or certainly for a guy who may have been behind violence.
He didn't look much like a gangster, had no reputation himself for violence, although obviously his bootlegging operations involved occasional killings and beatings. Any major bootlegging operation necessarily had to include such things.
Boo Boo Hoff had an office in a downtown bank building. It was here that he ran his unique blend of legal and illegal enterprises.
He had good ties with some of the top police officers. Probably, in part, not so much through his bootleggings as through a shared interest in boxing. I mean, this was a guy who owned boxers, who was part of the sporting world of Philadelphia, and would have gotten to know lots of politicians and policemen at fights.
It's a crooked enterprise in large measure in those days. There are many fixed fights, there are many fixed odds, bets are often smelly. It's a natural place for the gangsters, and it also gives them a cover. If they're in another city away from their base to have a meeting with a gangster, they can say they're just there for a boxing match. And obviously there's a connection between the violence of boxing and the violence of the underworld. The gangsters of all people were not going to object to the violence of boxing. They liked it. It's blood. It's something they're used to and comfortable with. It's a natural place for them.
Boo Boo Hoff used his political connections to move into a number of profitable areas. With the onset of Prohibition, he turned his attention to Philadelphia's massive industrial alcohol industry, to companies like Publickers and Quaker Industrial Alcohol.
What they're doing then is redistilling the alcohol to make it palatable, consumable in beverages. Unfortunately, they typically don't do a very good job of this. And the city coroner reports that 10 to 12 people a week are dying from alcohol poisoning. And it's probably an undercounting because, of course, if Dad has died from tainted gin, his family doesn't want the neighbors or the minister to find out about it.
It would be wonderful to have a good drink of this before lunchtime.
Only part of Philadelphia's alcohol was doctored. Most of the rest arrived via Europe and Canada. Sometimes it came straight up the Delaware through the docks, and sometimes, just sometimes, the Coast Guard caught the bootleggers. But more often than not, Philadelphia's booze made its way in via Rum Row. Philadelphia's bootleggers had a perfect area for smuggling, among the vast stretches of tidal salt marshes on the Delaware Bay. There were few people there, just isolated fishing and farming families.
So the mobsters from Philadelphia would go down to South Jersey and they would hire, particularly after the Depression hit, they would hire these oystermen, fishermen who couldn't make a living anymore at their trades and stick them on a powerboat. They'd run out to the ships, waiting ships from Canada or whatever. They'd fill it, the rum running boat with booze, often in steel cases in case they had to dump it if a revenue or cutter came along and pick it up later. And then they'd run the stuff into these isolated rivers, creeks, and inlets along the bay and the Delaware estuary. The farmers then warehoused the stuff, and it could stay there for a week, a day, or months. And it became a very important part of the local economy.
The mobsters didn't just hand over the drink to their clients. They wanted a bigger piece of the action. They moved into entertainment.
There's a natural connection between the bootleggers and the nightclubs because where do the nightclubs get their liquor? Obviously from the bootleggers. So the bootleggers become partners with many of the people running the nightclubs at that time, and ultimately they own many of the clubs.
Boo Boo Hoff ran the Turf Club in the Sylvania Hotel and several other clubs, which attracted the city's upper class. At the speakeasies, the elite could rub elbows with the underworld.
The speakeasy was the daring in place to go. Anybody who was anybody wanted to be seen in these kinds of places. You had to have a business card to get in. You had to know the owner. There was a daringness to it. There was a bravado. In a sense, it was kind of a voyeuristic thrill. You were doing something daring. You were tweaking the nose of Uncle Sam while at the same time experiencing a great new art form in jazz. Socializing with the highbrows of society and the literati and the Gold Coast mavens. It was a wonderful time to be alive.
Now here's a very entrancing phrase. It will put you in a daze. But to me it don't mean a thing. 'Cause it's got a very peculiar swing.
Many of America's most famous musicians played in the speakeasies, also rubbing elbows with mobsters.
There was a certain affinity between the gangsters and the jazzmen. They have a certain common ground, nocturnal habits, a style of dressing, disapproval by the straight world, things to hide, glamorous women, secrets. They understood each other in interesting ways at a time when blacks and whites had very little contact as social peers.
There was no question who ran the show. Take New York's Cotton Club, one of the fanciest nightclubs in the country. Its ownership was concealed, but the boss was Owney Madden. Owney Madden wants the best entertainers. He wants Duke Ellington, and he's distressed when in 1927, the Duke goes to play at Philadelphia's Standard Theater.
So Owney Madden calls down to his buddy in Philadelphia, Maxie Boo Boo Hoff, and Boo Boo Hoff sends his associate, Charlie Yankee Schwartz, over to the manager of the Standard, who delivers his famous line, "Be big or be dead." And Ellington and the orchestra pack up their bags, head back to New York, and begin their famous engagement at the Cotton Club.
And thereafter, anytime Ellington wants to take his band on the road, he has to pay Cab Calloway's band to take his place at the Cotton Club. The connection is that tight. Essentially, Madden owns Ellington's band in those years.
In Philadelphia, the sound of music was turning ugly, and the bell began to ring for reforms. When the city elected a new mayor, Freeling Kendrick, he asked President Coolidge to send someone to clean up the city. Marine Brigadier General Smedley Darlington Butler arrived and started a determined campaign to stomp out crime and enforce prohibition. Butler discovered that nearly everyone was on the take: the police, the politicians, and the mobsters.
Butler becomes increasingly frustrated. He goes public with his frustrations. He gets in arguments with the mayor. And finally, before leaving after the end of his second year, in a speech before a group of women in Pittsburgh, he calls Philadelphia a cesspool on the edge of the state and says that Philadelphia simply lacks the will or resolve to enforce prohibition.
Philadelphians are upset about the situation. So in 1928, Judge Edwin Lewis convenes a grand jury to look into the matter. He takes lots of evidence from lots of witnesses, and the story is grisly. The extent of the graft, he estimates that about $2 million a year is being paid to Philadelphia cops and politicians by the bootleggers.
In August 1928, the jury announced its findings. It was a damning indictment of the Philadelphia police. They had discovered 24 high-ranking officers with bank accounts worth about $750,000. Not bad when the average policeman's salary was only about $2,000 a year. The policemen came up with some weak excuses. Some said they had been lucky in crap games. Others that they had bet on the right horse. In the end, 138 policemen were found unfit for service.
Boo Boo Hoff, the grand jury's final statement, says he's probably behind all of this, but we can't indict him. He's too insulated by fronts and covers. And so the grand jury really amounted to not very much. Some interesting information, but no arrests. No prosecutions came from it. They could not touch Boo Boo Hoff.
Boo Boo Hoff survived Prohibition without going to jail. But there were crime fighters who refused to give up. And one was an extraordinary young woman. At the time, a rare figure in American justice.
Alcohol is hindering the coming of world peace because it is befuddling the thinking of humanity. It is no laughing matter today when the National Survey of Education on Alcoholism states that one out of every 6 boozers are women.
It was the women's movement, the suffragettes, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the powerful Anti-Saloon League that had been the driving force behind Prohibition. So it was logical, if somewhat radical, for a woman, Mabel Walker Willebrandt, to be asked to enforce the new law.
A woman was very important to be in that position because Prohibition was looked at as a woman's issue. Women had just gotten the vote. So it was a high visibility position. It was a moral crusade to many people.
Mabel Walker Willebrandt was an unusual woman. She was born in Kansas, began school at 13, was a principal by 22, a lawyer at 27, and was just 32 when President Harding appointed her Assistant Attorney General in 1921. She became the enemy of the bootleggers and of what would become organized crime.
For all of my life, I've had the most uncanny feeling that always seems to say to me, you are marked to step into a crisis sometime as the instrument of God. It seems that it may mean danger or disgrace or in some way cause me agony of heart, but I can't escape it. With recurring frequency, I've had the feeling so often all my life, since I was a very little girl. Lately, I've quit fighting it.
Apparently, trying to enforce Prohibition was that special mission that God had in mind for her. That gave her the strength she needed to persist, but it also gave her a kind of fanatical edge.
Willebrandt believed in upholding the law of prohibition. She had wine, certainly before, or whiskey sours before she came into office. She didn't drink at all while she was in office, and she worked fiercely and was viewed as a zealot to enforce the law.
It's often said that drinking actually went up during Prohibition, but that wasn't the case. The only thing that went up was the price. Name brand whiskey, for instance, went from $0.10 a shot to as much as $3. People may have just thought there was more drinking because it was more daring, more celebrated, more extreme. One drink's recipe from the time captured the atmosphere.
Take 3 chorus girls and 3 men. Soak in champagne till midnight. Squeeze into an automobile. Add a drunken chauffeur and a dash of joy. Shake well. Serve at 70 miles an hour. Chaser, a coroner's inquest.
The saloon had been replaced by speakeasies, some of which lived up to their Hollywood image of secret peepholes, breathless passwords, and fantastic decor. Many of the best-known people in society visited the speakeasies.
So you have millions of lawbreakers, perfectly law-abiding citizens otherwise, who now are breaking a federal law by drinking. And so the line becomes blurred, and organized crime is much more intertwined in American life because of Prohibition in a way that it had not before then.
She kept saying that the upper class, the Kennedys of this world, had a particular responsibility. She felt that was very important, and she pressed that and said there seemed to be sometimes just then the working class that was out there made prey of the bootleggers.
But she found herself with few true allies in the Justice Department.
She was surrounded by older, skeptical men who were doubtful about the whole enterprise. She got very little cooperation from the attorneys general. Harry Daugherty, for example, Harding's notoriously crooked attorney general, gave her no cooperation.
The Justice Department made a great song and dance about clamping down on bootleggers, calling in the newsreel cameramen to show their dramatic raids to the public.
When I was appointed to this office, I stated publicly and promised myself that we would enforce the national prohibition policies honestly and earnestly and lawfully. I do not like spectacular methods or anything that may be described as a drive. Steady, relentless pressure, intelligently applied to the maximum of our resources at all times and in all seasons is our aim and intention.
The truth was that the feds frequently turned a blind eye. The Prohibition Bureau agents were poorly paid and easily bribed. 1 in 12 was dismissed for corruption, and many quit to become bootleggers. But Willebrandt refused to give up. She began a campaign in Florida, where much of the booze was coming in via the Bahamas and Cuba. Willebrandt was determined to clamp down.
The most dramatic was in Florida, where she really got all of the government agencies, the Navy, which sent down 11 destroyers, the Coast Guard, you had 30 vessels, 2 airplanes, and in a gigantic attack, you really had them make tremendous raids.
It was something of a personal triumph for Willebrandt, but when she turned her attention to padlocking New York's speakeasies, she stirred up criticism.
People did call foul because they thought it was a little unfortunate that you were having all of these raids, and the raids were highly publicized because there were so many of them, plus which the U.S. attorney obviously was not agreeing with Mabel and was giving out adverse stories that there was a sort of Roman holiday going on there. But great was Flapdoodle. She just blew it off and said, This is something we've been doing, and in her annual report that year, she pointed out that 7,000 padlocks, injunctions had been actually instituted that year, and she was pleased because after the headlines went, they'd taken 18 to court, and they'd found guilty 15 of them.
But Willebrandt was getting worn down by the constant struggle.
Mabel's great frustration was you always got the little fish. It was very hard to get the big fish, and she wanted the big fish. She had a cartoon that she kept which showed her with a mop trying to mop it up and keep it back, the incoming waves. And it was obvious that there was this inundation coming. When she left office in 1929, she wrote to her parents that she felt very often like the little boy who put his arm in the dike. And so she'd stopped a lot of things, she said, but it's a wearing way to be a hero.
Years later, a judge said of Willebrandt, if Mabel had worn trousers, she would have been president. But despite her good work, some of the worst criminals in American history were beginning to emerge. The most important legacy of Prohibition was the creation of organized crime. But it wasn't the Irish gang nor the Jewish mob that would ultimately rule. It was the Cosa Nostra, better known as the Italian Mafia.
The Italians had the Mafia. No one else had that secret criminal brotherhood, and that gives the Italians an extraordinary cohesiveness and a kind of national organization that the Irish and Jewish gangs did not have.
From the quiet, dark alleys of Little Italy to the flamboyance of Al Capone, the Italian criminals have survived and flourished like no others. But to understand their dominance in the underworld, one must go back. After World War I, powerful Irish gangs controlled the lucrative Brooklyn waterfront, collecting tribute, about $1,500 a week, from each of the more than 60 dock owners. Those who declined saw their wharves and vessels looted, burned, or wrecked, or worse.
The East Coast Longshoremen has been a mobbed-up union for most of this century. It started even before Prohibition. Originally with Irish guys on the Brooklyn docks. It was a very dangerous occupation to be head of the Longshoremen's Union on the Brooklyn docks because you had a short life expectancy. 6 or 8 guys in a single decade would take this job, be killed off, someone else would get the job, be killed off.
The Brooklyn Bridge area was traditionally Irish territory.
The White Hand Gang, or shall we say the Irish Mafia, they were an underworld superpower. They had control, literal control over 60 piers in operation in Brooklyn at the time. It was a gold mine.
But the White Hand would soon meet their match. The Italian gangs, known as the Black Hand, wanted the riches for themselves. From 1920 to 1925, a grim war raged along the waterfront for control of the lush extortion rackets. For a time, the leader of the White Hand, Wild Bill Lovett, held off the Italian Black Hand.
While Bill Lovett was the most spectacular gang leader the White Hand ever had. On the waterfront, everybody knew that this man will, as soon as look at you, blow your head off. The man was a very dangerous man, really.
No less fearless was the Italian leader of the Black Hand, Frankie Yale. He retained an iron-fisted control over his men.
Frankie Yale was the first celebrity godfather. No question about it.
Yale was the first of the openly flamboyant gangsters. He was known as the Prince of Pals. He was an extremely popular person, not least for the fact that he liked to cultivate a sort of Robin Hood image of taking from the rich and giving to the poor.
For instance, during the coal strike of 1922, Yale's men delivered coal to hundreds of families who were freezing. This was the paradox about Frankie Yale. He was vicious, and yet he was also sympathetic.
The reason for Frankie Yale's generosity, in my personal opinion, was he was born into abject poverty. He knew what it was to be poor. And he had, his heart went out for the poor people.
But still, the bloody feud went on, and Yale needed tough henchmen.
He was introduced to Alphonse Capone at a very young age, and he took a liking to Al. He tutored Al in the ABCs of the underworld.
Yale put Capone to work as a bartender and a bouncer in his dance club. From his humble beginnings in Brooklyn, Al Capone would carry a nickname for the rest of his life: Scarface. One night while Capone was working, he told a female customer, "You got a beautiful ass." Her brother, Frank Galluccio, took out his knife, aimed for Capone's throat, but instead slashed his face 3 times. Gangsters live dangerously, and before long, Capone savagely beat up a member of the White Hand Gang. Their leader, Wild Bill Lovett, came looking for him.
Frankie Yale got word that Wild Bill Lovett was trying to track down Capone. He says, "Al, look, the best thing I could tell you, this man is gonna, sooner or later, with the scars and all for identification, he's gonna get you, sooner or later."
So Frankie Yale sent Al Capone to work with Johnny Torrio in Chicago. It proved a lucky move. When Prohibition began, Frankie Yale mobilized his Black Hand troops into bootlegging, using his links in Chicago.
What Prohibition did was it took rather loosely organized neighborhood gangs and it put them into transnational communication with each other. Because what was involved was the shipping of various liquors from one part of the country to another, even from outside the country, it was of enormous benefit towards making this a sort of national combination.
The White Hand's power was waning. Their leader, Wild Bill Lovett, was gruesomely murdered by the Black Hand. When Richard Peg-Leg Lonergan took over, Al Capone returned to Brooklyn to get rid of this Irish gang once and for all.
Sylvester Agulia was the man chosen to start the ball in motion. He was to whack a top lieutenant of the Irish White Hand gang across the head with a meat cleaver. That was the signal. The lights went out and the gunfire erupted immediately. The outcome was the murder, a triple gangland murder, as a matter of fact. Al Capone had finally murdered a man, Richard Lonergan. It turned out to be the most important murder of his whole career. His reputation throughout the Italian underworld nationally really zoomed, because what he actually did was hand over the entire Brooklyn waterfront to the Italian underworld. And after, very soon after, the White Hand gang evaporated into nothing at all, just died out.
Now Frankie Yale controlled the New York waterfront and was Al Capone's chief liquor supplier. Capone quickly became Chicago's crime boss. It was the beginning of the rise of the Italian Mafia.